Roman infantry tactics refers to the theoretical and historical deployment, formation, and maneuvers of the Roman infantry from the start of the Roman Republic to the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The article first presents a short overview of Roman training. Roman performance against different types of enemies is then analyzed. Finally, a summation of what made the Roman tactics and strategy militarily effective through their long history is given below, as is a discussion of how and why this effectiveness eventually disappeared. The focus below is primarily on Roman tactics, the how of their approach to battle, and how it stacked up against a variety of opponents over time. It does not attempt detailed coverage of things like army structure or equipment. Various battles are summarized to illustrate Roman methods with links to detailed articles on individual encounters. For in-depth background on the historical structure of the infantry relevant to this article, see Structure of the Roman Military. For a history of Rome's military campaigns, see Campaign History of the Roman Military. For detail on equipment, daily life, and specific legions, see Roman legion and Roman military personal equipment. Evolution. Roman military tactics and strategy evolved from that typical of a small tribal host seeking local hegemony, to massive operations encompassing a world empire. This advance was affected by changing trends in Roman political, social, and economic life, and that of the larger Mediterranean world, but it was also undergirded by a distinctive Roman way of war. This approach included a tendency towards standardization and systematization, practical borrowing, copying and adapting from outsiders, flexibility in tactics and methods, a strong sense of discipline, a ruthless persistence that sought comprehensive victory, and a cohesion brought about by the ideal of Roman citizenship under arms, embodied in the legion. These elements waxed and waned over time, but they form a distinct basis underlying Rome's rise. Some key phases of this evolution throughout Rome's military history include military forces based primarily on heavy citizen infantry with tribal beginnings and early use of phalanx-type elements. See military establishment of the Roman kingdom. Growing sophistication as Roman hegemony expanded outside Italy into North Africa, Greece, and the Middle East. See military establishment of the Roman Republic. Continued refinement, standardization, and streamlining in the period associated with Gaius Marius, including a broader-based incorporation of more citizenry into the army, and more professionalism and permanence in army service. Continued expansion, flexibility, and sophistication from the end of the Republic into the time of the Caesars. See military establishment of the Roman Empire. Growing barbarization, turmoil, and weakening of the heavy infantry units in favor of cavalry and lighter troops. See foederati. Demise of the Western Empire and fragmentation into smaller, weaker local forces. This included the reversal of status of cavalry and infantry in the Eastern Empire. Cataphract forces formed an elite, with infantry being reduced to auxiliaries. Manpower. Numerous scholarly histories of the Roman military machine note the huge numbers of men that could be mobilized, more than any other Mediterranean power. This bounty of military resources enabled Rome to apply crushing pressure to its enemies, and stay in the field and replace losses, even after suffering setbacks. One historian of the Second Punic War states, according to Polybius, 2.24, the total number of Roman and Allied men capable of bearing arms in 225 exceeded 700,000 infantry and 70,000 cavalry. Brunt adjusted Polybius figures and estimated that the population of Italy, not including Greeks and Bruttians, exceeded 875,000 free adult males, from whom the Romans could levy troops. Rome not only had the potential to levy vast numbers of troops, but did in fact field large armies in the opening stages of the war. Brunt estimates that Rome mobilized 108,000 men for service in the legions between 218 BC and 215 BC, while at the height of the war effort, 214 BC to 212 BC, Rome was able to mobilize approximately 230,000 men. Against these mighty resources, Hannibal led from Spain an army of approximately 50,000 infantry and 9,000 cavalry. Rome's manpower reserves allowed it to absorb staggering losses yet still continue to field large armies. For example, according to Brunt, as many as 50,000 men were lost between 218 BC and 215 BC, but Rome continued to place between 14 and 25 legions in the field for the duration of the war. Moreover, as will be discussed below, Roman manpower allowed for the adoption of the so-called Fabian strategy, which proved to be an effective response to Hannibal's apparent battlefield superiority. Put simply, the relative disparity in the number of available troops at the outset of the conflict meant that Hannibal had a much narrower margin for error than the Romans. Equipment and training. Equipment. Individual weapons, personal equipment, and haulage. A legionary typically carried around 27 kilograms, 60 pounds, of armor, weapons, and equipment. This load consisted of armor, a sword called a gladius, a shield, 2 pila, 1 heavy, 1 light, and 15 days' food rations. There were also tools for digging and constructing a castra, the legion's fortified base camp. One writer recreates the following as to Caesar's army in Gaul: each soldier arranged his heavy pack on a T or Y-shaped rod, borne on his left shoulder. Shields were protected on the march with a hide cover. Each legionary carried about 5 days' worth of wheat, pulses or chickpeas, a flask of oil and a mess kit with a dish, cup, and utensil. Personal items might include a dyed horsehair crest for the helmet, a semi-water resistant oiled woolen cloak, socks, and breeches for cold weather and a blanket. Entrenchment equipment included a shallow wicker basket for moving earth, a spade and slash or pickaxe like dolabra, or turf cutter, and 2 wooden staves to construct the next camp palisade. All these were arranged in the marching pack toted by each infantryman. Fighters traveled in groups of 8, and each octet was sometimes assigned a mule. The mule carried a variety of equipment and supplies, including a mill for grinding grain, a small clay oven for baking bread, cooking pots, spare weapons, water skins, and tents. A Roman century had a complement of 10 mules, each attended by 2 non-combatants who handled foraging and water supply. A century might be supported by wagons in the rear, each drawn by 6 mules, and carrying tools, nails, water barrels, extra food and the tent and possessions of the centurion commanding officer of the unit. Artillery package. The legion also carried an artillery detachment with 30 pieces of artillery. This consisted of 10 stone-throwing onagers and 20 bolt-shooting ballistas. In addition, each of the legion's centuries had its own Scorpio bolt thrower, 60 total, together with supporting wagons to carry ammunition and spare parts. Bolts were used for targeted fire on human opponents, while stones were used against fortifications or as an area saturation weapon. The catapults were powered by rope and sinew, tightened by ratchet and released, powered by the stored torsion energy. Caesar was to mount these in boats on some operations in Britain, striking fear in the heart of the native opponents according to his writings. His placement of siege engines and bolt throwers in the towers and along the wall of his enclosing fortifications at Alesia were critical to turning back the enormous tide of Gauls. These defensive measures, used in concert with the cavalry charge led by Caesar himself, broke the Gauls and won the battle and therefore the war for good. Bolt throwers like the Scorpion were mobile and could be deployed in defense of camps, field entrenchments, and even in the open field by no more than 2 or 3 men. Training. Over time the military system changed its equipment and roles, but throughout the course of Roman history, it always remained a disciplined and professional war machine. Soldiers carried out training common to every organized army, from initial muster, arms and weapons drill, formation marching and tactical exercises. According to Vegetius, during the 4-month initial training of a Roman legionary, marching skills were taught before recruits ever handled a weapon, since any formation would be split up by stragglers at the back or soldiers trundling along at differing speeds. Standards varied over time, but normally recruits were first required to complete 20 Roman miles, 29.62 kilometers or 18.405 modern miles, with 20.5 kilograms in 5 summer hours. The Roman day was divided into 12 hours regardless of season, which was known as the regular step or military pace. They then progressed to the faster step or full pace and were required to complete 24 Roman miles, 35.544 kilometers or 22.086 modern miles, in 5 summer hours loaded with 20.5 kilograms, 45 pounds. The typical conditioning regime also included gymnastics and swimming to build physical strength and fitness. After conditioning, the recruits underwent weapons training. This was deemed of such importance that weapons instructors generally received double rations. Legionaries were trained to thrust with their gladii because they could defend themselves behind their large shields, scuda, while stabbing the enemy. These training exercises began with thrusting a wooden gladius and throwing wooden pila into a quinton, wooden dummy or stake, while wearing full armor. Their wooden swords and pila were designed to be twice as heavy as their metal counterparts so that the soldiers could wield a true gladius with ease. Next, soldiers progressed to armatura, a term for sparring that was also used to describe the similar one-on-one training of gladiators. Unlike earlier training, the wooden weapons used for armatura were the same weight as the weapons they emulated. Vegetius notes that roofed halls were built to allow for these drills to continue throughout the winter. Other training exercises taught the legionary to obey commands and assume battle formations. At the end of training, the legionary had to swear an oath of loyalty to the SPQR, Senatus Populusque Romanus, or the Senate and the Roman people, or later to the emperor. The soldier was then given a diploma and sent off to fight for his living and the glory and honor of Rome. Organization, leadership, and logistics. Command, control, and structure. Once the soldier had finished his training, he was typically assigned to a legion, the basic mass fighting force. The legion was split into 10 subunits called cohorts, roughly comparable to a modern infantry battalion. The cohorts were further subdivided into 3 maniples, which in turn were split into 2 centuries of about 60 to 100 men each. The first cohort in a legion was usually the strongest, with the fullest personnel complement and with the most skilled, experienced men. Several legions grouped together made up a distinctive field force or army. Fighting strength could vary, but generally a legion was made up of 4,800 soldiers, 60 centurions, 300 artillerymen, and 100 engineers and artificers, and around 1,600 non-combatants. Each legion was supported by a unit of 300 cavalry, the equites. Supreme command of either legion or army was by consul or proconsul or a praetor, or in cases of emergency in the Republican era, a dictator. A praetor or a propraetor could only command a single legion and not a consular army, which normally consisted of 2 legions plus the allies. In the early Republican period, it was customary for an army to have dual commands, with different consuls holding the office on alternate days. In later centuries, this was phased out in favor of one overall army commander. The legati were officers of senatorial rank who assisted the supreme commander. Tribunes were young men of aristocratic rank who often supervised administrative tasks like camp construction. Centurions, roughly equivalent in rank to today's non-commissioned or junior officers, but functioning as modern captains in field operations, commanded cohorts, maniples, and centuries. Specialist groups like engineers and artificers were also used. Military structure and ranks. An in-depth analysis of ranks, types, and historical units including their evolution over time is beyond the scope of this article. See Structural History of the Roman Military and Roman Legion for a detailed breakdown. Below is a very basic summary of the legion's structure and ranks. Force structure. Contubernium, tent unit of 8 men. Centuria, 80 men commanded by a centurion. Cohort, 6 centuries or a total of 480 fighting men. Added to these were officers. The first cohort was double strength in terms of manpower, and generally held the best fighting men. Legion, made up of 10 cohorts. Field army, a grouping of several legions and auxiliary cohorts. Equites, each legion was supported by 300 cavalry, equites, subdivided into 10 turmi. Auxilia and velites, allied contingents, often providing light infantry and specialist fighting services like archers, slingers, or javelin men. They were usually formed into the light infantry or velites. Auxilia in the Republican period also formed allied heavy legions to complement Roman citizen formations. Non-combatant support, generally the men who tended the mules, forage, watering and sundries of the baggage train. Rank summary. Consul, elected official with military and civic duties, like a CO president, there were two, but also a major military commander. Praetor, appointed military commander of a legion or grouping of legions, also a government official. Legatus legionis, the legate or overall legion commander, usually filled by a senator. Tribune, young officers, second in command of the legion. Other lesser tribunes served as junior officers. Prefect, third in command of the legion. There were various types. The Prefectus Equitarius commanded a unit of cavalry. Primus Pilus, commanding centurion for the first cohort, the senior centurion of the entire legion. Centurion, basic commander of the century. Prestige varied based on the cohort they supervised. Decurio, commander of the cavalry unit or turma. Aquilifer, standard bearer of each legion, a position of much prestige. Cynefer, one for each century, handled financial matters and decorations. Optio, equivalent to a sergeant, second in command for the centurion. Cornisan, horn blower or signaller. Imaginifer, carried standard bearing the emperor's image. Decanus, equivalent to a corporal, commanded an a-man tent party. Munifex, basic legionary, the lowest of the trained rank and file. Tirones, new recruit to the legions, a novice. Logistics. Roman logistics were among some of the best in the ancient world over the centuries, from the deployment of purchasing agents to systematically buy provisions during a campaign, to the construction of roads and supply caches, to the rental of shipping if the troops had to move by water. Heavy equipment and material, tents, artillery, extra weapons and equipment, millstones etc., were moved by pack animal and cart, while troops carried weighty individual packs with them, including staves and shovels for constructing the fortified camps. Typical of all armies, local opportunities were also exploited by troops on the spot, and the fields of peasant farmers unlucky enough to be near the zone of conflict might be stripped to meet army needs. As with most armed forces, an assortment of traders, hucksters, prostitutes and other miscellaneous service providers trailed in the wake of the Roman fighting men. Battle. Initial preparations and movement for battle. The approach march. Once the legion was deployed on an operation, the marching began. The approach to the battlefield was made in several columns, enhancing maneuverability. Typically a strong vanguard preceded the main body, and included scouts, cavalry and light troops. A tribune or other officer often accompanied the vanguard to survey the terrain for possible camp locations. Flank and reconnaissance elements were also deployed to provide the usual covering security. Behind the vanguard came the main body of heavy infantry. Each legion marched as a distinct formation and was accompanied by its own baggage train. The last legion usually provided the rear force, although several recently raised units might occupy this final echelon. Construction of fortified camps. Legions on a campaign typically established a strong field camp, complete with palisade and a deep ditch, providing a basis for supply storage, troop marshalling and defense. Camps were recreated each time the army moved, and were constructed with a view to both military necessity and religious symbolism. There were always 4 gateways, connected by 2 main crisscrossing streets, with the intersection at a concentration of command tents in the center. Space was also made for an altar and religious gathering area. Everything was standardized, from the positioning of baggage, equipment, and specific army units, to the duties of officers who were to set up sentries, pickets and orders for the next day's march. Construction could take between 2 and 5 hours with part of the army laboring, while the rest stood guard, depending on the tactical situation. The shape of the camp was generally rectangular, but could vary based on the terrain or tactical situation. A distance of about 60 meters was left clear between the entrenchments and the first row of troop tents. This gap provided space for marshalling the legionnaires for battle and kept the troop area out of enemy missile range. No other ancient army persisted over such a long period in systematic camp construction like the Romans, even if the army rested for only a single day. Breaking camp and marching. After a regimented breakfast at the allocated time, trumpets were sounded and the camp's tents and huts were dismantled and preparations made for departure. The trumpet then sounded again with the signal for stand by to march. Mules and wagons of the baggage train would be loaded and units formed up. The camp would then be burned to the ground to prevent its later occupation and use by the enemy. The trumpets would then be sounded for a final time and then the troops were asked 3 times whether they were ready, to which they were expected to shout together ready, before marching off. Intelligence. Good Roman commanders did not hesitate to exploit useful intelligence, particularly where a siege situation or impending clash in the field was developing. Information was gathered from spies, collaborators, diplomats, and envoys, and allies. Intercepted messages during the Second Punic War, for example, were an intelligence coup for the Romans, and enabled them to dispatch 2 armies to find and destroy Hasdrubal's Carthaginian force, preventing his reinforcement of Hannibal. Commanders also kept an eye on the situation in Rome, since political enemies and rivals could use an unsuccessful campaign to inflict painful career and personal damage. During this initial phase, the usual field reconnaissance was also conducted, patrols might be sent out, raids mounted to probe for weaknesses, prisoners snatched, and local inhabitants intimidated. Morale. If the field of potential battle were near, movement became more careful and more tentative. Several days might be spent in a location studying the terrain and opposition, while the troops were prepared mentally and physically for battle. Pep talks, sacrifices to the gods and the announcements of good omens might be carried out. A number of practical demonstrations might also be undertaken to test enemy reaction as well as to build troop morale. Part of the army might be led out of the camp and drawn up in battle array towards the enemy. If the enemy refused to come out and at least make a demonstration, the commander could claim a morale advantage for his men, contrasting the timidity of the opposition with the resolution of his fighting forces. Historian Adrian Goldsworthy notes that such tentative pre-battle maneuvering was typical of ancient armies, as each side sought to gain maximum advantage before the encounter. During this period, some ancient writers paint a picture of meetings between opposing commanders for negotiation or general discussion, as with the famous pre-clash conversation between Hannibal and Scipio at Zama. But whatever the truth of these discussions, or the flowery speeches allegedly made, the only encounter that ultimately mattered was battle. Deployment for combat. Pre-battle maneuver gave the competing commanders a feel for the impending clash, but final outcomes could be unpredictable, even after the start of hostilities. Skirmishing could get out of hand, launching both main forces towards one another. Political considerations, exhaustion of supplies, or even rivalry between commanders for glory could also spark a forward launch, as at the Battle of the Trebia River. The Roman army after the reforms of 107 BC was also unique in the ancient world because when lined up opposite an enemy readying for battle, it was completely silent except for the orders of officers and the sound of trumpets signaling orders. The reason for this was because the soldiers needed to be able to hear such instruction. The optios of the legions would patrol behind the century, and anyone who was talking or falling to obey orders immediately was struck with the stick of the optio. This silence also had the unintended consequence of being very intimidating to its enemies because they recognized this took immense discipline to achieve before a battle. Layout of the triple line. Once the machinery was in motion, however, the Roman infantry typically was deployed, as the main body, facing the enemy. During deployment in the Republican era, the maniples were commonly arranged in triplex aces, triple battle order, that is, in 3 ranks, with the hastati in the first rank, that nearest the enemy, the principes in the second rank, and the veteran triarii in the third and final rank as barrier troops, or sometimes even further back as a strategic reserve. When in danger of imminent defeat, the first and second lines, the hastati and principes, ordinarily fell back on the triarii to reform the line to allow for either a counter-attack or an orderly withdrawal. Because falling back on the triarii was an act of desperation, to mention falling on the triarii, ad triarios rediis, became a common Roman phrase indicating one to be in a desperate situation. Within this triplex aces system, Contemporary Roman writers talk of the maniples adopting a checkered formation called quincunx when deployed for battle but not yet engaged. In the first line, the hastity left modest gaps between each maniple. The second line consisting of principes followed in a similar manner, lining up behind the gaps left by the first line. This was also done by the third line, standing behind the gaps in the second line. The velites were deployed in front of this line in a continuous, loose formation line. The Roman maneuver was a complex one, filled with the dust of thousands of soldiers wheeling into place, and the shouting of officers moving to and from as they attempted to maintain order. Several thousand men had to be positioned from column into line, with each unit taking its designated place, along with light troops and cavalry. The fortified camps were laid out and organized to facilitate deployment. It might take some time for the final array of the host, but when accomplished the army's grouping of legions represented a formidable fighting force, typically arranged in 3 lines with a frontage as long as 1 mile, 1.6 kilometers. A general 3-line deployment was to remain over the centuries, although the Marian reforms phased out most divisions based on age and class, standardized weapons, and reorganized the legions into bigger maneuver units like cohorts. The overall size of the legion, and length of the soldier's service also increased on a more permanent basis. Maneuvering. As the army approached its enemy, the velites in front would throw their javelins at the enemy and then retreat through the gaps in the lines. This was an important innovation since in other armies of the period skirmishers would have to either retreat through their own army's ranks, causing confusion, or else flee around either flank of their own army. After the velites had retreated through the hastity, the posterior century would march to the left and then forward so that they presented a solid line, creating a solid line of soldiers. The same procedure would be employed as they passed through the second and third ranks or turned to the side to channel down the gap between the first and second rows en route to help guard the legion's flanks. At this point, the legion then presented a solid line to the enemy and the legion was in the correct formation for engagement. When the enemy closed, the hastity would charge. If they were losing the fight, the posterior century returned to its position creating gaps again. Then the maniples would fall back through the gaps in the principes, who followed the same procedure to form a battle line and charge. If the principes could not break the enemy, they would retreat behind the triarii and the whole army would leave the battlefield in good order. According to some writers, the triarii formed a continuous line when they deployed, and their forward movement allowed scattered or discomfited units to rest and reform, to later rejoin the struggle. The manipular system allowed engaging every kind of enemy even in rough terrain, because the legion had both flexibility and toughness according to the deployment of its lines. Lack of a strong cavalry corps, however, was a major flaw of the Roman forces. In the later imperial army, the general deployment was very similar, with the cohorts deploying in quincunx pattern. In a reflection of the earlier placement of the veteran triarii in the rear, the less experienced cohorts, usually the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 6th, and 8th, were in the front, the more experienced cohorts, 1st, 5th, 7th, 9th, and 10th, were placed behind. Formations. The above is only standard procedure and was often modified. For example, at Zama, Scipio deployed his entire legion in a single line to envelop Hannibal's army just as Hannibal had done at Cannae. A brief summary of alternative formations known to have been used is shown below. Combat. Hand-to-hand engagement after release of missile weapons. Once the deployment and initial skirmishing described above took place, the main body of heavy infantry closed the gap and attacked on the double. The front ranks usually cast their pila, and the following ranks hurled theirs over the heads of the front-line fighters. After the pila were cast, the soldiers then drew their swords and engaged the enemy. Emphasis was on using the shield to provide maximum body coverage, while attacking with their gladius and thrusts and shortcuts, minimizing exposure to the enemy. In the combat that ensued, Roman discipline, heavy shield, armor and training were to give them important advantages. The acute shock of combat. Some scholars of the Roman infantry maintain that the intense trauma and stress of hand-to-hand combat meant that the contenders did not simply hack at one another continuously until one dropped. Instead, there were short periods of intense, vicious fighting. If indecisive, the contenders might fall back a short distance to recuperate, and then surge forward to renew the struggle. Others behind them would be stepping up into the fray meanwhile, engaging new foes or covering their colleagues. The individual warrior could thus count on temporary relief, rather than endless fighting until death or crippling injury. As the battle progressed, the massive physical and mental stress intensified. The stamina and willpower demanded to make yet one more charge, to make yet one more surge grew even greater. Eventually one side began to break down, and it is then that the greatest slaughter began. Use of war machines and covering fire. Many Roman battles, especially during the late Empire, were fought with the preparatory fire from ballistas and onagers. These war machines, a form of ancient artillery, fired arrows and large stones towards the enemy, although many historians question the battlefield effectiveness of such weapons. Following this barrage, the Roman infantry advanced, in 4 lines, until they came within 30 meters of the enemy, then they halted, hurled their pila and charged. If the first line was repelled by the enemy, another line would rapidly resume the attack. Often this rapid sequence of deadly attacks proved the key to victory. Another common tactic was to taunt the enemy with feigned charges and rapid arrow fire by the auxiliaries equites, auxiliary cavalry, forcing the enemy into pursuing them, and then leading the enemy into an ambush where they would be counterattacked by Roman heavy infantry and cavalry. 3-line system advantages. Flexibility. Some ancient sources such as Polybius seem to imply that the legions could fight with gaps in their lines. Yet, most sources seem to admit that more usually a line would form into a solid front. Various approaches have been taken to reconcile these possibilities with the ancient writings. The advantages of gaps are obvious. When a formation is on the move, it can more easily flow around obstacles, and maneuver and control are enhanced as the Romans did.
Please subscribe and thanks for watching.